joined us. So here we are, and welcome to this presentation by the IRR, by Anthea Jeffery, Dr. Anthea Jeffery, and myself, Gabriel Crouse. We're going to be talking about the Disaster Management Act and the National Coronavirus Command Council, where we are virologically, what the law says, what the courts have ruled, and what we need to do to restore the norms of our constitutional democracy. This meeting is being recorded. We encourage questions and answers from our guests. Please use the Q&A function that you'll find most likely at the bottom of your screen. But if you can't find that, feel free to post your question in the chat. We're going to go through the presentation first, and then we will be fielding those questions. So make a note of them as you're going along. Feel free to do that. To give a brief overview of what this is going to look like, I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about the data from an empirical perspective. Where are we in relation to this pandemic and it going endemic? What does that mean? And Anthea Jeffery is going to be talking about the laws involved with the powers exerted by the Command Council and where they draw those powers from, especially. Okay, without any further ado, here we go. I'm just going to get my little laser pointer. Please feel free to follow this. It should help, if I'm any good, at directing you through this rather surprising tale, I think. One that has a dollop of hope, but not in the wishy-washy sense, very much in the practical sense, that there is a target worth aiming for and something that we can achieve. So the first graph that we're looking at is from the United Kingdom. When the pandemic initiated, there were many comparisons made between South Africa and the UK. Some arguments were made that we were outperforming this former colonial overlord. Indeed, the UK did not have a good start to the pandemic, but it seems to pave the way or shine a light on what it looks like for the pandemic to come to an end. Before getting into too much detail, I just want to remind people of what it was like in March 2020. That's when this graph begins. At that point, the world almost overall was entering into hard lockdown. We were living through a nightmare of a new pandemic. And with that was born a dream. The dream was to beat COVID by driving it into extinction. The dream was zero COVID. That dream has proved to be a pipe dream, a fool's errand, an unachievable goal. Since the end of 2020 and going especially into 2021, we have seen the capacity for SARS-CoV-2 to generate escape mutations that render both convalescent protection, that's the protection you get when you've become ill and you've recovered and now have a new immune level of shielding against falling very ill or succumbing to the illness completely on the second round. That protection is strong, but it is partially escaped. And so it's not a sterilizing protection. You can get sick again and infect others. Likewise, the escape mutations mean that vaccines are non-sterilizing. Once you've been vaccinated, you're in a much stronger position to ward off death or serious illness, but you can still catch it and pass it on. Together, that means that zero COVID becomes the unfortunately unachievable goal, and we have to look for something more. Now, if we look at the cases, the case numbers coming out of the UK, we see three distinct waves. The first wave, when lockdowns were initiated, efforts at flattening the curve are exaggerated by what we look at here. In fact, testing, and we can see this from the positivity rates, was hugely underestimating the number of people that were being infected. So the wave, in fact, was much higher than this suggests. In the second wave, we see further caseload increase. Some of this is really, the virus is doing worse. Some escape and other variant mutations have occurred in the United Kingdom. And in the third wave, it seems to be much like the second wave. The third wave that the UK is currently still undergoing seems to be very much like the second wave, maybe a slightly flatter curve, but also a more elongated process. And so adding up to the same dire story, COVID seems to have us in its grip all the way through. But if you look at the death numbers, and the death numbers here are the red line, and they're being measured off the right-hand side of the y-axis, you see a completely different story. In the first wave, deaths and cases climbed together. Again, there is some underestimation in these cases. In the second wave, they're really syncing up. And the delay in the curve between the cases increasing and the deaths increasing is exactly what one would expect, because it takes some time after one has been confirmed positive with COVID for one to succumb, unfortunately, to the disease. The median time is somewhere around 14 days, and that's very much what we're reading off of the curves here with these delayed peaks. But look at the third wave. Although there is a dramatic third wave in terms of case numbers, there has been a highly subdued third wave in terms of deaths. Now, the reason for this is simple. It's because the United Kingdom acquired new levels of immune protection at an individual level, time by time. That means a body has triggered a response, almost always in their case through vaccination. 2/3 of their population is vaccinated by around here, almost 3/4 by now. And that means that while many people are still catching the illness, far fewer are dying. Nevertheless, in this period, the United Kingdom was put under, its government was put under heavy pressure to reintroduce lockdown measures, to ramify disaster management procedures, basically to treat the third wave as if it was the same as the second wave, on the basis that the cases in terms of the load seem to be very similar. However, the UK government refused to look at cases only and looked also to deaths, and saw that if the point of the exercise is not to try and drive COVID extinct, but rather to try and save lives and save livelihoods, a return to hard lockdown could not be justified. Instead, the vaccination effort should be celebrated. People should attend to this difference between deaths and cases. Now, this pattern will be the pattern worldwide, one way or another. It might come sooner, it might come later, but the end of COVID does not look like extinction. It doesn't mean that the cases completely go away. If the end of COVID comes around the world, it will look like this. Now, the UK has managed to achieve this endemic status where COVID sticks around, but is no longer a national scale threat by vaccination. That is the least costly way to do it. Not every country will achieve that. Let's move on to Denmark, which is the first European country not only to end all lockdown measures, but also to end what are often called vaccine passes or vaccine passports. In September, the Danish government agreed that people should be allowed to go night clubbing, where obviously people are in very close proximity, often so close that they are touching, and often so much that they're touching with their lips, the surest way to spread the disease. Nevertheless, they said you can go night clubbing without showing that you've been vaccinated. Why did they do that? Well, let's have a look. Cases in Denmark, similar to the UK, the wave here is underestimated. Here you see the true second wave. The third wave is relatively subdued in terms of case numbers. In fact, you might split it in terms of a third and fourth wave. Still, these are serious numbers. And we're looking here at cases per million population. We were looking at the same thing with the UK to adjust for the different sizes of these countries. So has the Danish policy of allowing people to go night clubbing and do anything else in terms of their own risk management rather than being compelled or nudged, has this been a disaster? Have we seen a similar third wave in terms of deaths? Let's have a look. We have not. While you see the dramatic first and second wave in terms of deaths, the third wave is invisible, or insofar as it is visible, falls below the level of a national crisis. And it's on this basis that the Danish government said, in our country, COVID was a major critical threat, but now it is an ordinary dangerous illness. For individuals that are not yet vaccinated, they should make the decision of how to deal with that ordinary and dangerous illness. But at a national level, the numbers are so low that they are our attention towards them is being outcompeted by other concerns, other causes of death, and other causes of long-term social erosion, particularly those that would occur if the government maintained its hands on the reins of power as if this was a critical national emergency. That's not what it is anymore. Okay, so that's Denmark and the UK. What about Russia? Russia seems to be following a similar pattern. Big first wave in cases, big second wave in cases, big third wave in cases. In fact, this sort of slides down and either begins a fourth wave or is a continuation of the third wave. It's very much having a grim autumn in terms of cases. Now, if you just naively follow what the first two slides suggest, you might expect that deaths likewise are going to go up and down, but they're going to stay flat here. Let's have a look. Exactly the opposite has happened in Russia. It is not only having a bad time in terms of cases, it's having a bad time in terms of deaths. Now, 6-7 deaths per million population per day. This is the same scale that I was using in the other graphs. You can see that it is 7 times more roughly where the UK and Denmark are. This is seriously problematic. What's the reason for it? Quite simply, whereas the UK and Denmark in this period, starting at around the beginning of the year, maybe towards the end of the first quarter, whereas this period here was one of intense and widespread vaccination in the UK and Denmark. In Russia, vaccine uptake was much slower. In fact, only about 1/5 of the country got vaccinated. That protection was very useful for those individuals. But at a national level, it has not done much to stop not only the spread of COVID, but more importantly, deaths that result therefrom. That's to say that there are large numbers of vulnerable prey for the virus, and they have been, too many have been tragically taken out. So the question then becomes, is South Africa at the moment in Denmark and the UK's position, or is it in Russia's position, where despite the fact that it's already had these waves, it has neither acquired the new immune protection through vaccination, nor through convalescence in order to protect itself from a fourth deadly wave? Let's have a look at South Africa's situation so far. We see major cases, major well-defined 3-wave journey. And when we look at deaths per million population, and please do take note that here the scale is slightly higher, we see the following. It's a grim tale, and it's one that we all know because we've lived through it, those of us who were lucky enough to do so. First wave, devastating. Second wave, even more so. The third wave, in terms of cases, rivals, in fact, exceeds the second wave. In terms of deaths, it is somewhat subdued. Now, some of that may be explained by the vaccination uptake we've had, but remember that our vaccination uptake is less than Russia's and has always been less than Russia's. Insofar as Russia's vaccine uptake failed to prevent a third wave in deaths, we can't expect our lower vaccine uptake to have succeeded in somewhat divorcing the connection between cases and deaths. Something else must explain this partial dip. The best hypothesis at the moment is that what partially explains it is the most costly form of immune protection, which is convalescent protection. That is to say, many South Africans getting sick and then recovering. Now, if we look through the history of Discovery's estimates of what proportion of South Africa had been infected, we see that after the first wave, Discovery estimated that roughly a quarter had been infected. After the second wave, roughly half had been infected. And naively, some might have hoped that this would mean we would be guarded against a deadly third wave. In fact, it would have helped us had we introduced measures that really did reduce the odds of viral spread at that point, and had we also introduced vast numbers of vaccinations. But our taxis remained clogged, our logistics in general remained highly dangerous, the questions that needed to be answered there in practical form were not, and our vaccine program was retarded. Therefore, with South Africans running out of the patience, the money, the wherewithal to stay at home, to avoid family gatherings, and to stay away from work, opportunities that expose them to risk. In short, with COVID fatigue setting in, what minimal national level protection was offered by 50% of the country having been infected at this point, or 40%, something like that, was overwhelmed by our social behaviors, driving spread to, as I said earlier, vast numbers of vulnerable prey, people who were COVID naive. Nevertheless, there is this discrepancy to be explained. And if the thesis is to be taken seriously, based on Discovery's estimate that at this point, as many as 80% of South Africans have been infected, and remember that convalescent protection is more robust, more long-lasting, and right off the bat stronger than vaccine protection, then we might wonder whether we have nevertheless, in the most costly fashion, entered the UK-Denmark scenario, where if you extend this into the future, you find cases rise again, but deaths stay relatively flat because our protection levels are in fact higher than the UK and Denmark. This is what would follow if it were true that, as Discovery estimates, roughly 80% or slightly less, 70% of the population had recovered from the disease by now. If that's the case, then we need to seriously rethink where we are in terms of our disaster management. Even if it's not the case, we need to look at where we really are for sure, and that is in a deep trough, which cannot possibly justify extraordinary derogation or abrogation rather of Parliament's oversight. But Anthea Jeffery will talk you through that. My point here is just that while I am looking to the future and the past, I don't want us to forget where we are at present. So to look into the future to test the hypothesis that Discovery's estimates are right, and therefore that we will have a divorce between death numbers and case numbers, such that case numbers continue to go up and down, but death numbers stay relatively flat. Let's look at the Eastern Cape. The Eastern Cape, more than any other province, was estimated through seroprevalence studies. That's people testing blood samples, sometimes in hospitals from people taking other procedures, sometimes in small-scale studies where they use random uptake. The Eastern Cape seemed to have the highest infection rates going through the second wave. It seemed, therefore, no coincidence that that was the first place that the first serious escape mutation was found. Has that made any difference? Before I show you the data, I just want to draw your attention to the axes here. The x-axis is weeks. So this is counting from week 1 of the second wave and week 1 of the third wave. Week 1 of the second wave begins somewhere in November, goes through to the end of January. Week 1 of the third wave begins, I think, somewhere in June and goes through 13 weeks from there. These are the peak points in the Eastern Cape in particular. Bear in mind that the third wave was somewhat started earlier in some provinces than others, so I made sure to use the peaks of the Eastern Cape in particular. And here we have COVID confirmed deaths. Now on this, you see a very clear pattern. The second wave comes along. It has a dramatic spike in terms of deaths and it retreats. The third wave stays roughly flat. That suggests, since the Eastern Cape had almost no vaccination through the third wave, that natural protection through convalescence explains the divorce between cases and deaths in that province, which, as it were, was at the cutting edge of South Africa's rather costly way of developing some level of immunity. Still, you might wonder, is something going awry here? After all, the Eastern Cape notoriously had too few ambulances in Port Elizabeth to do almost anything, too few hospitals to deal with all its patients, and most importantly, a huge distinction between the number of excess deaths and the number of COVID deaths, the highest P-score, which is a statistical measure of how those things come apart, which is to say, if ever one were to suppose that in a province, COVID deaths were going unreported because poor people were dying at home without getting tested of a terrible disease and without even being able to make it to a clinical hospital, that would have taken place in the Eastern Cape. So let's look at the excess death figures. These are coming from the SAMRC, and they are worrying. In the Eastern Cape, excess deaths by several factors outnumber confirmed COVID deaths in the second wave. Here, the pattern is even clearer. The second wave is truly devastating in the Eastern Cape. Those sharp spikes are smoothed out because what most likely explains the flat before the spike is a failure to confirm the COVID deaths associated at these points. But in the third wave, we see, again, even on the excess data, a relatively flat line. So the third wave deaths, you can't say that in the Eastern Cape, the third wave was truly terrible. We just didn't pick it up, because we are picking up excess deaths reliably. The coroner's office being one of the last fully functioning or relatively fully functioning institutions in the country. Nevertheless, the line in the third wave is relatively flat. Now, what I'm going to overlay here, and you read these numbers off the right-hand side of the y-axis, are the cases. These are confirmed cases. Now, the blue line is the second wave, and you see second wave cases come up and go down alongside the deaths. This is the pattern that you saw in the United Kingdom in the second wave too. But the third wave, the cases climb dramatically and then start to fall, whereas the deaths stay flat. This, in short, is exactly the pattern that we saw in Denmark and in the UK. It's a pattern that cannot be explained in our case by vaccination. It's a pattern that cannot be explained in our case by such a high degree of improved hospital care in the Eastern Cape. It's a pattern that can only reliably be explained by the introduction of new levels of immune protection, and that coming at great cost through vast numbers of South Africans in the Eastern Cape being infected, recovering, and then when they get infected again, being much better protected against death. So when we look back, we see this pattern in the Eastern Cape as it has been there. It is plausible to suppose that it might be in the rest of the country. It seems very much that the Eastern Cape took 2 waves to get to this point, and that the rest of the country has taken 3. But that is the state of play. That is a way to explain where we are, which is not fully open, but relatively open compared to where we were. And therefore, our behavior would be suggestive of increasing case and death numbers. But that is not in fact happening. And where to look forward is not that we avoid a 4th wave. It seems most likely that there will be a 4th wave of cases, but that we might expect the 4th wave of deaths to be relatively flat. Okay, that's looking forward. Maybe things don't work out that way. If they don't, we could always quickly reintroduce the disaster management. But I am starting to encroach on Anthea's time and subject matter. So without further ado, let me hand it over to her. Anthea.
Thank you, Gabriel. So as Gabriel was indicating there at the end, what the South African government has primarily relied on in countering COVID has been the Disaster Management Act. And we have had the state of disaster extended from one month to the next for many occasions now. Most recently, the designated minister, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, extended the state of disaster for another month until the 15th of November 2021. The question really is the DMA the appropriate vehicle? And it's useful in answering that question to start by looking at how DMA rules contrast with emergency rules and the safeguards that are provided there. And these are to be found in section 37 of the Constitution. If we could just move to that. Emergency rule under section 37 of the Constitution can be declared to counter a threat to the life of the nation, and also if it's necessary to restore peace and order. What we see is that emergency rule can last only for 21 days unless the state of emergency is extended by the National Assembly, by Parliament, for a maximum of 3 months at a time. And the first extension needs a 51% majority. Later ones need a special majority of 60%. And each time the extension can be voted on only after there's been a public debate in Parliament and all the relevant issues have been aired. In addition, according to the Constitution, the courts may decide at any point on the validity of the initial declaration of emergency rule, on the validity of any extension, and on the validity of any legislation enacted or other action taken in order to deal with the emergency. What we also see is that you can have legislation which derogates from, which means limits or suspends guaranteed rights, but only to an extent that is first strictly required by the emergency, and secondly, is still consistent with South Africa's international law obligations. In addition, no legislation may derogate from what are called the non-derogable rights, which are listed in the Constitution. And those non-derogable rights include the rights to life and human dignity, from which no derogation at all is possible, as long as aspects of the right to equality, for example, the right not to be unfairly discriminated against on the basis of race, aspects of the right to freedom and security, particularly the protection against torture, aspects of the right to due process, particularly the right not to be compelled to make a statement and to be able to appear in court yourself to contest your detention. So these are the sorts of safeguards we have under the emergency rules. But the Disaster Management Act, by contrast, has no such safeguards. So let's just go through what it allows. The designated minister, in this case, Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, can declare a national state of disaster if existing legislation is inadequate, which is rather a vague test, or if special circumstances require, also vague. No parliamentary approval is needed. The minister can then make regulations on specified and various other issues, including the movement of people, the suspension of alcohol sales. Interestingly, there's no mention of the suspension of any other sales, and recovery measures. The normal duration of a state of disaster will be 3 months, though it could, of course, come to an end earlier than that, as the Act recognizes. It can be extended for a month at a time by the designated minister, simply by notice in the Government Gazette. And again, there is no parliamentary approval that is needed for any extension. And that's why earlier this week, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma could simply extend it for yet another month by publishing the relevant notice in the Gazette. And there's also no parliamentary approval required for any of the minister's regulations. Once she's gazetted them, they have full force and effect. So it's been, various challenges have been raised to the DMA, and I'm going to just briefly outline 4 of the key ones that have been made over time. Most of these challenges were brought in May 2020, as South Africa was emerging from the very strict lockdown that we now call level 5 and into level 4, which was also a pretty strict lockdown. This particular challenge was brought by the Freedom Front Plus, and it argued that the DMA is unconstitutional. Its argument, in essence, involved looking at Section 37 of the Constitution, as we've been doing, and saying that the declaration of an emergency requires parliamentary approval, as does any extension of that emergency. But under the DMA, we can have the most extraordinary restriction of fundamental rights, and yet there are no safeguards on the exercise of executive power. And the political party argued that this was unconstitutional. But the Pretoria High Court disagreed. Essentially, it said emergency rule permits constitutional deviations and allows the suspension of rights, and that's why parliamentary oversight is needed. By contrast, the DMA does not permit such deviations from the constitutional order, and it does allow court challenges to any limitation of rights which is imposed by regulation. And that challenge can be brought under Section 36, the justification clause, and that's why no special safeguards are necessary. Just briefly to remind us all of what Section 36 says. In essence, this is the test which is used. Because no guaranteed right can be absolute, there will be limits imposed on rights from time to time. Are those limits valid? It depends on a proportionality test. The courts will look at the importance of the right that's being limited, the purpose of the limitation and the importance of that purpose, and in essence, whether less restrictive means could have been found to achieve that purpose. So that's the essence of the Section 36 right. And the court was saying citizens can always go to court to challenge regulations on that basis. If we look at what seems to have been wrong with the court judgment, and here my comments are briefly, and we're using blue text to show this as comment rather than summary from the judgment. It's incorrect to imply that emergency rule will always result in a deviation from the constitutional order and the suspension of rights. Often there'll be a far more limited limitation of rights. So it's not the reason why parliamentary oversight is needed for emergency rule. In addition, it's the DMA, which is not supposed to permit this, which has actually brought about deviations from the constitutional order. This is precisely what has happened in practice since March 2020. We have had the most extraordinarily far-reaching limitations on fundamental rights, which have been imposed by ministerial regulation without parliamentary scrutiny, certainly without any form of parliamentary approval. And it's unreasonable to leave it to citizens to challenge regulations one by one through the courts, which is a very costly and difficult exercise. The better option would be to require parliamentary approval for limitations on rights, as we have under emergency rule, and also parliamentary approval for any extension of disaster rules. We turn now to another challenge. This was brought by the HSF, or the Helen Suzman Foundation, which didn't try to challenge the constitutionality of the DMA, but argued it's a short-term measure only. And this was the essence of their argument. The DMA is supposed to be a short-term measure, so it was fine to use it at the start. But the government now needs to enact new legislation to deal with the COVID issue and to protect the rights that are being limited by lockdowns, and it has failed to do so. But the court again gave that short shrift. This was the Gauteng High Court once again, and it said that there are various provisions in the DMA which point to a possible lengthy duration. For example, the DMA can be used for progressive disasters that unfold over time. And it's also intended to cover the post-disaster recovery phase, which could occur only sometime later. But this was the key point for the court, that the DMA does not place any ceiling on the number of times a disaster can be extended for another month. And it said Parliament could easily have included such a ceiling if it had intended the DMA to be a short-term measure only. So the Helen Suzman Foundation argument failed. But again, there are weaknesses in the judgment. In particular, the time period which the DMA sets up for a state of disaster is normally 3 months, and that the court seemed to disregard. In addition, monthly extension is of course permitted and has happened time and again since COVID began. But that monthly extension was probably permitted in the Act because it was quite impossible for Parliament to foresee that a national state of disaster, especially one so far-reaching in its limitations on fundamental rights, would be maintained for 19 months and counting. I'm pretty sure that Parliament just did not foresee that. So it's incorrect to assume that the absence of a ceiling implies Parliament's approval of the situation, and one would certainly need to check Hansard to make sure that this was what was intended. And the other wording relied on by the court is not particularly important. You could have a progressive disaster, for example, from a hurricane. It starts with a very high wind, which brings down electricity, which in time affects water supply as well. But the whole saga will not necessarily last for very long before the normal processes of law become competent again to deal with the situation that has arisen. If we look now to the next case, this was a challenge to the validity of level 4 regulations, particularly those restricting movement and freedom to trade. And these were the level 4 regulations because the case was launched in May 2020. It went on appeal to the Supreme Court of Appeal, which handed down judgment in January this year, and said it was particularly concerned about those restrictions on movement, confining people to their homes infringes on the right to movement, which it said is a foundational right. It also infringes on their human dignity. Restrictions on trade and occupation and profession grossly affect the way in which people can earn a living and infringe on dignity too. So the court said that means these rights are prima facie unconstitutional, and the onus shifts to the minister to justify these rights, to show that they meet the justification criteria in Section 36. Which means, as we said, what is the importance of the right being limited? What is the purpose of the limitation? Is there a less restrictive way to achieve that purpose? Well, in Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, in essence, argued this, that the government had to protect other rights, such as the right to life. And so people needed to stay home to reduce transmission. The less movement, the less interaction, the less transmission. Ibrahim Patel, the Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition, more people at work would mean more people at risk, particularly for those using public transport. And then also we had Professor Salim Karim putting great emphasis on this point, that lockdowns would also highlight the COVID threat. They would rapidly and starkly convey to people that they needed to change their behavior. So this was the best way to get people to change their behavior quickly. If the government just relied on its normal communication methods, people would be slow to change and the virus would have the chance to spread. So if one looks again at the kind of approach that the SCA took, it seemed to accept without any further evidence or argument that the lockdown would be effective in saving lives, even though millions of South Africans live in overcrowded informal settlements and would not be able to maintain proper social distancing, whether we had a lockdown or not. It didn't seem to consider whether less intrusive means of countering the pandemic could not be found. For example, by helping those particularly vulnerable to COVID-19 infection, such as the elderly, to stay home and limit their contact with others. And it also seemed willing to overlook the excess deaths that were likely to result, not just from the pandemic, but very much from the lockdown restrictions, that there could be excess deaths from untreated illnesses. We know now that many people were unable to obtain their ARVs. There could be interruptions to accepted vaccine programs, polio and measles, which would affect children in particular. There would be worse poverty and malnutrition as livelihoods were disrupted and people lost jobs and income. None of these factors seem to feature in the SCA judgment. If we look to what it had to say on the validity of the policy decisions made by the National Coronavirus Command Council, the students who brought this case challenged 3 policy decisions made by the NCCC to implement the lockdown, to extend it, and then to shift the country from level 5 to level 4 in May 2020. And the court looked into the NCCC and accepted the government's evidence that at first it comprised 19 ministers, plus the president, and then it was expanded to include the entire cabinet from the 20th of March. It also accepted Dlamini Zuma's view that the NCCC simply has an advisory and coordinating role. It helps to coordinate government's response. It allows ministers to interact with each other. But at the end of the day, it's the ministers that make the decisions and not the NCCC. What the court also said is that the NCCC is a cabinet committee, and the cabinet may function through committees and arrange its affairs largely as it pleases. So the court concluded decisions taken by some cabinet ministers bind the entire cabinet, and the NCCC decision to shift to level 4 was a valid decision of the cabinet, which put an end to that challenge. But again, one can raise other points. Of course, the court overlooks the bigger picture and the political realities. That the executive, whether constituted as the cabinet or the NCCC, should not have untrammeled capacity to limit fundamental rights by regulation. That Parliament cannot so delegate its lawmaking power that if it does so, that this is an infringement of the normal separation of powers. And as the SCA also stressed, Parliament's lawmaking capacity is vital because it helps to promote openness and accountability. It's what facilitates public participation in the legislative process. And when you have ministerial regulation, by contrast, that's not possible at all. But the SCA did strike down some regulations, which we can look back on, those of us who were around at the time. The very strict limits on outside exercise for only 3 hours a day, the sale on hot cooked food, which were found not to be justifiable and so struck down. But it was a bigger picture that the court obviously really couldn't look at because the political considerations lie in many ways outside its remit, which shows the limits of lawfare and suggests that we actually need political pressure and political action if the DMA is to change. So what is interesting to see is that there is in fact a DMA amendment bill currently before Parliament. It's a private member's bill that was put forward by the Freedom Front Plus. And it would amend the DMA to include the kind of emergency safeguards that we have in Section 37 of the Constitution. So, for example, a national state of disaster would normally end after 21 days unless the National Assembly voted to extend it. That the National Assembly would only be able to extend it for 3 months at a time, that the first extension would require a 51% majority, but any subsequent ones would require that special majority of 60%. That each time there would have to be a prior public debate in which all the relevant issues could be aired in Parliament. And that the minister, according to the FFF Plus bill, would have to table any disaster regulations, which she has gazetted in the National Assembly too, and Parliament would then have the power to disapprove them by 51% majority, in which case they would fall away, which is a variation on the idea that Parliament must legislate for derogations from fundamental rights, not the minister. So that's the bill which is currently before Parliament. There has been very little attention given to it, but it may be that this bill provides at least a vehicle for putting some limits on the Disaster Management Act as we move now into the very different COVID situation which Gabriel has been sketching. And on that basis, Gabriel, I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Anthea. I think you covered a lot of legal and judicial ground there lucidly and succinctly. We'll deal with questions, but first, I just want to conclude this conversation by saying there is one question which we've already been asked. We launched a petition to disband the Coronavirus Command Council to rethink or redraw the rules of the Disaster Management Act and to terminate the implementation of the National State of Disaster. What's the relationship between those things? In a sense, the Coronavirus Command Council is the spear, which at the moment only makes recommendations. Initially, it made 1 or 2 decisions, but in effect, as just another name for cabinet, but with these superpowers, is able to impose on our lives without the kind of usual parliamentary protections that we have. This is the spear. The handle is the disaster, the state of disaster, and the Disaster Management Act. That's the handle which wields the spear, and they are co-evil. They were born at the same time, the NCCC and the disaster, and they will terminate at the same time. The NCCC will lose its special powers through recommendation and through cabinet, through decision, only at the point when we recognize that when you look outside, when you look at the numbers today, South Africa has many disasters. Our unemployment rate is a disaster. Our public schooling is in a state of disaster and long has been. Electricity provision, water reticulation, so on down the line. There are many disasters. COVID at the moment is not a top priority disaster. It's certainly not putting us in a state of disaster that should justify these kinds of extraordinary measures. Now, in case you have any doubt that we should just sit around and wait, we should defer, we should allow the superpower to change the way our democracy works for as long as they worry and feel that tomorrow might bring something scary. Let's cast our mind back to Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma's role in postponing the elections. A couple of months ago, she proclaimed the election prematurely, before registration could take place, effectively disenfranchising hundreds of thousands of South African voters. She said that she was doing that for various reasons, but the thrust of it was that she didn't want the election to take place. She believed, according with the Musaneke report, that October and November would be terrible times. We wouldn't be able to go out and vote. It would be far too much COVID around. And so we better wait until a later point. The best scientists in the country all suggested that this would be a trough, as it's proven to be, on the basis of the same kinds of thinking that I tried to elaborate earlier. Nevertheless, Dlamini Zuma tried by disenfranchisement to remove the lifeblood of democracy, to remove the vote, on the basis that let's just wait until coronavirus is extinct and then we can vote. Then we'll know that it'll be safe. If we wait until coronavirus goes extinct in order to disband the Command Council and stop the state of disaster, we will have signed the death warrant of South Africa's constitutional democracy. The best evidence suggests that COVID is not going away. The best evidence suggests that COVID is becoming radically less deadly. The best evidence, in short, suggests that COVID is going endemic. Now, I don't want to say that for sure the fourth wave in South Africa is going to be a mild one. It might not be. But while we're in the situation that we are in, while we have literal breathing room, we need to think about what got us in the mess in the first place of having a Command Council rule our lives for 19 months. And that is the Disaster Management Act. So the long-term project has got to be changing that act. And that project needs to start now. And with that, I draw an end to our presentation and warmly welcome Q&A, questions that we hope to answer from our guests. Thank you very much. I'm just going to call on David to say that I am I see one comment in the chat from Kashia Africa, a copy of the presentation. We are recording this, as I said at the start of the presentation, and we will be formatting that recording and sending it out to everyone who is invited to attend here.
Gabriel, perhaps Kashia is referring there to the slides as well, which I'm sure you could make available.
Gladly. That makes sense. Sorry, correct. So we'll be sharing the slides and the presentation.
Oh, actually, yeah. Kashia, I see, has a question in the Q&A. How do we move forward from here? If this is your observation, how do we put this in action? How does this look in action?
Very good. Thank you, David. I missed the Q&A spot there.
No.
So I think let me start this out, and Anthea, buttress me where you see fit. In South Africa, we're used to challenging government overreach through the courts. In fact, we're used to, not just going through the formal courts, but also through special commissions chaired by acting justices or retired judges and so on. So we have, I think, a strong national sense of familiarity with the process of saying something's going wrong, the government's doing something wrong, so let's get ourselves into a special chamber with a judge and let's make our case, and then let's get a ruling that changes it. That is one way to go forward. But look, we're in the build-up to a municipal election. If your municipality is not delivering services, with exceptional circumstances, you may go to court and sue for the right to reticulate your own water. But in the general course of things, the normal democratic response is to make political change through voting. Now, voting happens once in a while. The normal democratic thing to do in between voting sessions is to reach out to your leaders, is to speak to parliamentarians, is to speak to those members of the executive that are sensitive to pressure. This does make change. We at the Institute have been around for 90 years, and that gives us a long sense of institutional memory. But we don't have to draw that far back. We can just look in the last few years to occasions in which public pressure, ordinary people speaking out and being heard by members of the media, and having their stories retold, can engender change. So the basic thrust here, in terms of disbanding the Command Council, in terms of ending the Disaster Management Act, in terms of scrapping those irrational regulations that are currently in place with no scientific basis for what they're doing about the coronavirus, but which are maintaining the sense that ultimately we're not in charge. That is all going to require some public pressure. And so we encourage people to join the petition. But furthermore, if we're going to, and by the way, I just want to draw one detail in terms of something that's quite tragic. If you look at South Africa's distinguishing coronavirus challenges, if in fact Discovery's estimates are right, we have the world's highest penetration of COVID-19. Why would that be? Our distinguishing feature is our logistics. South Africans on average spend more on transport, have to go further, do so in worse conditions than almost anyone else in the world. Our taxis, as I said, are clogged and are dangerous environments for spreading the disease. Now, we had the option of forcing the taxi industry to pay taxes in the long run, accept subsidies in the short run, and thereby run at a 50% capacity to reduce the odds of viral spread. We had the alternative option, as Anthea alluded to get people fired, to load shed, to job shed over 1 million jobs, and thereby reduce the logistical pressure, in the hopes that that might have some salutary effect in terms of stopping the disease from spreading. Now, only one of those options makes any sense at all, and it's not the option that we took. I think that South Africans that have jobs, that are well off, are in a comfortable place to say, let's wait and see. There's no disaster right now, but let's act as if there is a disaster because one might be coming. That's a luxury. For those people right on the breadline, it's not. So this is not just about doing it for yourself. There is a national interest argument to be made here, and people need to be making that argument to apply the pressure. But in the longer run, scrutiny needs to be applied to the Disaster Management Act Amendment Bill. We need to see where it can be refined. We need to see what its strong points are. And I think Anthea has highlighted those well. And that needs to be driven forward through the parliamentary process, through the consultation process, so that it can be attended to and so that it can be passed, so that we make sure we never fall into this morass again. So there's a two-step process. Deal with the reality right in front of you. You've got the Command Council above. It's the spear. Dlamini Zuma is the sharp end of it, trying to take away votes, trying to undermine freedoms. The handle is the Disaster Management Act. we need to whittle all three of those aspects away. And in the long run, make sure that the government can never arm itself against citizens with an excuse such as this again.
Gabriel, I'm afraid I need to go, but I'm going to hand over hosting rights to you. But I don't see any further questions in the chat. So perhaps that brings us to a natural conclusion. But thank you very much. I thought that was excellent.
Thank you, David.
And thanks to Anthea too.
Thank you.
Are there any final questions? I'm told that it's bad form. You should never ask that before concluding. But I had planned on this being an hour. We're a minute away from it. So you're allowed 1 minute to digest all of that information. And think if you have anything further to ask. In the course of which, let me just add one final point. South Africa is a very young democracy. And the sort of history of constitutional democracies is long enough for us to see the patterns. It's also easy to begin to think of parliamentary processes, of parliamentary oversight, of regulatory challenges as being esoteric and academic. You can't eat parliamentary oversight. You can't weigh it on a scale. And in times of crisis, countries that hold on to the constitutional norms that best navigate them through those crises are countries in which it's become second nature to rebuff the anti-intellectual who says, look, if I can't eat it and I can't weigh it, it doesn't matter. To say it does matter very much. This is the best safeguard against tyranny. In practically every occasion when a tyrannical leader has entered into a constitutional democracy, subverted its norms, and achieved dictatorship, it has always taken time, and there has always been an excuse. There's always been a very, very good excuse to give up on constitutional democracy. After all, democracy is all about disagreeing with each other. It's a bit slow. It's confusing. So let's give it up and deal with the immediate practical issue. There's room, as our constitution allows under a state of emergency, there's room for some special powers to be introduced. But those special powers must be limited. There must be safeguards. Precisely because power corrupts. The more of it you have, the more tempting it is to go from one excuse to the next for holding on to it. Few are the people who would relinquish power before they absolutely are forced to. In this regard, Nelson Mandela stands out as precisely the exception to the rule that once people have a superpower, they will not let go of that privilege. I think that South Africans are in a young democracy. It has not yet become second nature for us to stand up for our rights, and especially for parliamentary procedures. But we are a maturing democracy. We are getting there. And this could be a grand learning experience for us. We could return to our constitutional norms, not at the same old abnormal that we were, where, to be honest, government on many occasions was riding roughshod over our rights, but rather to a stronger place where we see that we're in it together, that we're citizens, that we have equal standing in that regard. And that means that our voices deserve to be heard, and that when they are coordinated and harmonized, they can pressure very real change. Let this be a teaching moment, I suppose, for South Africa's young democracy.